Hi everyone. If you were able to attend one of our cardiovascular presentations recently, we made a big point about talking about saturated fats, and we talked about the abundance of literature that's out there that shows that saturated fats are in fact not bad for us, as we were told in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, and that saturated fat consumption is actually not harmful for us for cardiovascular reasons or for overall mortality. And it's actually protective in many studies, particularly for strokes. So that research that we presented in these presentations has led a lot of people to start saying, well, yeah, but I just watched this movie on Netflix about the blue zones, and what you're saying is contradicted by this Netflix movie. So we thought we would address that in this little video here. So if you're not familiar with the blue zones, it was started back in 2005 by this guy named Dan Buettner, who works for National Geographic. And what they did is they sort of picked 5 different areas in the world where people tend to live a lot longer than other areas. And they tried to look at trends and patterns that those people in those areas, in those blue zones, follow that might be related to why they live longer. So you have to understand with the blue zones, it's not just about diet. There's a lot of things that I totally agree with the blue zones, as far as like exercise, keep moving, have faith, have a purpose in life, socialization. There's a ton of great things that is highlighted in the Blue Zones project that I love. But unfortunately, a lot of people just sort of come away with this idea that a plant-based diet is the way to go because that's what's in the blue zone. We have to understand that when you look at what's called observational studies or epidemiologic studies, that there's a lot of confounding factors that go into it, right? And when you look at studies that look at, plant-based diets, there is a lot of what's called healthy user bias in there. And so what healthy user bias means is, because this has been pounded into us for literally like 50 years now that saturated fat and red meat is bad for us. When people hear that and they are self-conscious about their health, they probably also exercise a lot more. They probably have, ways to mitigate stress. They probably drink less, like alcohol. They probably don't smoke. They just take care of their health a lot more than other people who may, be more radical and just say, well, I don't really care. And so not only are they eating red meat, but they're also like going to McDonald's and they're having red meat that's cooked in seed oils, and they're having the bun, which has, gluten and all these things. And they're probably having like a big Coke with it or a milkshake. And then they're having the French fries, which are also fried in seed oils, and that seed oil is kept heated all week long. And there's, whatever else. I mean, they're smoking, they're drinking a liter of Coke, they're doing whatever. So the basic gist is, when you look at these studies, a healthy user bias means you can't just say, oh, well, this one factor is doing it, because we have to look at everything else. So as an example, you could easily just say, well, who or what country in the world has the longest lifespan? And the answer would be Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong, generally, those people live longer than any other country in the world. And then if you correlate that with what country has the highest meat consumption in the world, well, guess what? It's Hong Kong. So you could just say, well, we're ignoring genetic factors and we're ignoring other lifestyle factors, and we're just going to say, well, if you eat more meat, you're going to have the longest life expectancy. So this is an example of the problems with just, these observational studies or epidemiologic studies. So this is highlighted in this British study where they looked at vegetarians versus non-vegetarians, and they said that vegetarians may live a little bit longer, and they said the low prevalence of smoking and generally high socioeconomic status of the participants, as well as other lifestyle and dietary factors, added to what's called, quote, the healthy volunteer effect, because they were asking for volunteers to come forward in the study for research. And that probably accounts for this low mortality. And they say, in conclusion, British vegetarians have low mortality compared with the general population. Much of this benefit may be attributed to the non-dietary lifestyle factors, such as low prevalence of smoking, generally high socioeconomic status, or to aspects of the diet other than the avoidance of meat and than fish. So again, the people who are more health conscious in these studies, and they're not eating meat because they've been told that that's bad for them, are also doing other things that they've been told are good for them, and they're just generally more health conscious. So another example would be this study here in Asian countries, and they pooled data from 8 different studies, which included over 100,000 men and 180,000 women, and they were followed, depending on the study that they looked at, anywhere between 6 to 15 years, and they said, quote, red meat intake was inversely associated with cardiovascular mortality in men and with cancer mortality in women. So if we say, enough with the observational studies because there's a lot of confounding factors in there, the best study to do then is what's called a randomized control trial, where you just take a group of people who are sort of like heterogeneous in their lifestyles, and you assign a diet to half of them and you assign a diet to the other half, and you follow them for 20 years. And I think you can understand the difficulty in that, right? Like, how are you going to tell someone to eat a certain way for a number of years and tell the other group, oh, you have to eat this way for a number of years? Like, it's very hard to design a study like that. But one way to get around that is to do it in institutional facilities. And this is what you could do back in the 60s and 70s. So there was a study called the Minnesota Health Study, is what it's colloquially called. And they took nursing homes and mental institutions, and without any consent of the participants, the researchers got rid of saturated fat in half the group, and they replaced it with polyunsaturated fats, which we were told were good for us, right? Omega-6 fats, and those are generally like seed oils. And the other group, continued to eat lots of saturated fat, and so that was sort of the control group, was the saturated fat group, and the other group was the interventional group, where they took away saturated fats. And this was done, in the late 60s, early 70s, and one of the lead authors was this guy, Ansel Keys, and he was like the main driving force behind all this stuff that came out saying that saturated fat was bad for us. So what were the results of this study? Well, interestingly enough, nobody ever published the data, which was interesting, until it was found in the basement of one of the researchers in the 2000s. And then they published the research, and lo and behold, they found, reducing saturated fat actually increased the rate of heart disease, and it increased mortality. It decreased cholesterol, which you can see here as highlighted in the study. But decreasing cholesterol isn't necessarily going to improve mortality or improve cardiovascular health. And so that led a lot of publications to start publishing headlines like this that says like, wow, if we would have known this, this could have changed the course of our dietary advice for decades. And this study wasn't the only one. There was also a number of other studies that the researchers sort of like chose not to publish for whatever biases or agendas that they had. They chose not to publish it. So if you want to read a good paper, there's this one in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they outline the history of how the sugar industry paid researchers to produce research that was basically fraudulent. And this is, a pretty authoritative source. This is the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they go on to say that, yeah, this is actually still happening today, which is, frankly, pretty frustrating. So if we just take a look at the blue zones idea here for a second, and again, before there's any judgment, I really like the blue zones idea for pretty much everything, but this idea of the plant-based diet is, the big takeaway. I disagree with. So if we take a look at just a couple of them here, like Okinawa, there's this paper called Nutrition for the Japanese Elderly. And what they did is they looked at the diet of different areas in Japan, and they looked at the centenarians there. And what they found was interesting, because it seems like people in Okinawa actually eat more fat and protein than other areas of Japan, which is directly contradictory to what we're told in the blue zones. And interestingly, they say they couldn't find any vegetarians amongst the centenarians. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but this was a published paper back in the 90s, and there's other ones like that. Or if we look at another example, here in California with Loma Linda, I mean, Loma Linda has a very high concentration of Seventh-day Adventists, which is they lead very, very healthy lives, right? And they exercise and they have community, and there's all these other aspects of what goes on with it, and they do primarily, not homogenously, but mostly eat plant-based diets. But if we look at another group that's fairly similar to them with the LDS community, they are also having a very good community aspect and faith and exercise, but they don't eat a plant-based diet, and Mormons generally live, about 7 years longer than the rest of California, just like the Seventh-day Adventist community. So is it really about the plant-based diet? I would argue no, and if you want, I can send you more research. There's just an abundance of research right now that's showing this whole idea of, demonizing saturated fat for decades was completely misplaced, and it seems like seed oils and trans fats are much, much worse for us. So if you have any questions about it, give us a call, send me an email if you want, that's fine, or attend one of our cardiovascular courses where we go into great depth about this. So thanks, hope you have a great week. Bye.